This map shows the current boundary line between the Eastern and Central time zones in the United States. Time zone boundaries in the United States are defined by the United States Department of Transportation. The original time zones were defined by the Interstate Commerce Commission. The following maps show how the time zone boundary moved from the original 1919 definitions to the current boundary observed today. In March 1918, Congress passed a law establishing time zones for the United States. The task of defining the boundary lines was given to the Interstate Commerce Commission. The initial boundaries drawn by the ICC went into effect on January 1, 1919. 5 months later the boundary was redrawn to include more of Ohio in the Central Time Zone. The area shown on this map is the June 1919 Central Time Zone. The red line is the original January 1919 boundary. In 1922 Toledo returned to Eastern Time. In 1924 Columbus returned to Eastern Time along with an area east of a more direct path between Toledo and Columbus. Later in 1924 the boundary moved west to include more of northern Ohio. In 1927 Cincinnati was moved to Eastern Time. Portions of Kentucky were also moved from Central to Eastern Time. In 1936 the remainder of Ohio and Lower Michigan were moved to Eastern Time. In 1941 the entire state of Georgia was placed in Eastern Time. In 1947 Eastern Tennessee was placed in Eastern Time. In 1949 2 additional Tennessee counties were placed in Eastern Time. In 1960 Eastern Kentucky was placed in Eastern Time. In 1961 North Central Kentucky was placed in Eastern Time along with the eastern portion of Indiana. In 1966 the Uniform Time Act required states to follow their designated time zones. Under the Uniform Time Act of 1966 states were required to observe the federally defined time zones and were required to observe daylight saving time based on federally defined dates. States were permitted to opt out of daylight saving time but were initially allowed to opt out only on a statewide basis. Indiana officially opted out of daylight saving time but unofficially observed daylight saving time in the Central Time counties. Counties near Louisville and Cincinnati also unofficially observed daylight saving time. In 1967 responsibility for drawing boundaries passed from the Interstate Commerce Commission to the Department of Transportation. In 1967 the governor of Indiana filed a petition to return the entire state to Central Time. In 1969 the Department of Transportation placed 80 of Indiana's 92 counties in Eastern Time. The Central Time counties of Indiana continued to observe daylight saving time. The Eastern Time counties did not observe daylight saving time. Residents of several counties near Louisville and Cincinnati continued to unofficially observe daylight saving time as fast time. Federal law was changed allowing Indiana to opt out of daylight saving time in the Eastern Time portion of the state without opting out in the Central Time portion of the state. In 1972 a small portion of coastal Florida was moved to Eastern Time. In 1973 most of the Upper Peninsula of Michigan was moved to Eastern Time. In 1977 Pike County, Indiana was moved to Eastern Time. In 1991 Stark County, Indiana was moved to Eastern Time. In 2000 Wayne County, Kentucky was moved to Eastern Time. In 2005 Indiana passed a law ending the state's non-observance of daylight saving time. As part of that law the Department of Transportation was invited to redraw the boundary between Eastern and Central Time through Indiana. In 2006 8 Indiana counties were moved to Central Time and the entire state officially observed daylight saving time. In March 2007 Pulaski County returned to Eastern Time. In November 2007 5 counties in southern Indiana returned to Eastern Time. This map shows the current boundary line. The aqua shaded area is the furthest east the boundary was ever drawn. The entire boundary from northern Michigan to Florida is shown here. Only the boundary in Florida follows the original 1919 definition. If the globe were divided into 24 equal segments to define time zones, the boundaries would follow the white lines shown here. The green lines show the average solar noon as the sun passes around the Earth. Solar noon is not a constant and drifts plus or minus 16 minutes every year. The times shown on this map are the offset from average solar noon in Greenwich, England. The current Eastern Time Zone is 92 minutes wide. The current Central Time Zone is 79 minutes wide. The Central Time Zone boundary deviates 19 minutes in Michigan from the boundary line in Florida. Time zone boundaries are drawn for the convenience of commerce. Since the original boundaries were drawn in 1919, people have preferred economic ties to eastern cities over solar time. The boundary between Central and Mountain Time has also moved west from the original 1919 boundaries. Based on solar time, Indiana would fit within either the Central or Eastern Time Zone. However, for the convenience of commerce, Indiana is best served by the current boundary.